Hey everyone, welcome back to POL 702, Advanced Techniques of Political Science Research. This week we're going to continue our discussion of linear regression, but we're going to introduce the idea of Bayesian inference in the context of regression. And in general, Bayesian inference involves three steps that go beyond classical frequentist estimation the way we talked about it last week and in the previous semester. One of the most important differences is that Bayesian inference combines basically the data and model into a posterior distribution rather than just a likelihood function, which we ultimately then summarize by a set of simulations of parameters from that model. Okay, so rather than maximizing a likelihood, we specify a posterior distribution, and then we're taking simulation draws from that posterior distribution. And this has a couple of advantages. One of the advantages is that we can use these simulations to easily propagate uncertainty around our estimates and around quantities of interest that might be functions of our estimates. Okay, so we can get simulation-based predictions for unobserved or future outcomes that account for the uncertainty in the model parameters themselves. Okay. The last step that kind of goes beyond classical frequentist inference and estimation is that we can, when we form this posterior distribution, we can include additional information into the model using prior distributions. Okay, so this week we're going to kind of explore each of these steps in more detail and how they can help us in our model building in linear regression. Okay. So the outline for this week, I have kind of three broader topics and three videos. The first one will contrast again, and we kind of started this discussion in our last Q&A session, but I will kind of summarize the key points and explain them in a little bit more detail, contrasting kind of maximum likelihood estimation in the context of OLS and kind of the idea of posterior sampling to get our estimates and importantly uncertainty around our estimates. Okay. Then the second part will focus on how we use our posterior samples to make predictions about new data sets and crucially incorporate uncertainty around our parameter estimates in those predictions using Bayesian inference. Okay, and then lastly, we will focus on prior information and Bayesian synthesis and kind of talk a little bit more about the idea of what different types of priors we can specify and what consequences these priors ultimately have on our on our estimates as well as on our predictions. Okay, so it should be an interesting week. Your to-do list is, of course, as always, to watch the lecture videos and go through the code for the session on RStudio Cloud. I have a bunch of graphics and plots that I'm going to show you in the upcoming videos, where I'm not directly showing the code in the slides, but all the code to reproduce all figures in my slides, as always, are going to be on RStudio Cloud. So make sure to check that out and play around with that code. Then for this week, read Gelman Hill, our textbook, Regression and Other Stories, chapters 9 and 10. Although our discussion this week will focus mostly on chapter 9, and we'll talk a little bit more about chapter 10 in the upcoming week. I also included some additional readings on simulating quantities of interest and interpreting interactions, which kind of use a similar argument regarding simulation to quantify uncertainty, but from a frequentist standpoint. And so I included those as optional readings that I really recommend you to take a closer look at. And we can talk more about those in the Q&A session as well. Then, of course, you still have to work on assignment 2, which will be due on Friday, February 26th. So make sure to finish that assignment and submit it on Canvas before the due date. Then lastly, I mentioned this last week as well, but since we're talking about interpreting regression coefficients and interpreting predictions of regression results and so on, make sure to review some of the old lecture videos from POL Sci 701, particularly for this week on section 9, interpreting OLS, just in case you feel like you want to kind of refresh your memory on any of those topics. Okay, I of course linked all those videos on Canvas as well. All right, so much for the overview. In the next video, I'm going to talk about maximum likelihood estimation versus posterior sampling.